Hi guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to show you my build of Takom's Jagdtiger. This is their 2-in-1 kit which enables you to build either late or early production version. And it's one of Takom's Blitz kits, which means it should be a simplified build compared to their normal kits. And if you look inside the box, you'll see that the upper and lower hull are just two gigantic pieces. So we'll see if that kind of simplification carries on throughout the build. The instructions are standard Takom affair. They're really quite clear, quite easy to follow. Though there is a little bit of a caveat later on in the instructions where each page looks like this, where each step is divided into two, and part 1 of each step is for the early production version and part 2 is for the late production version, so you just have to make sure that you're getting the right version. And quite often there are just very subtle differences, so it can be easy for your eye to wander and you get the wrong piece. I know that because I did it several times. So the build starts with the lower hull, the suspension and the wheels, and if you've built a Tiger B before, then you will be familiar with this. In fact, if you've built a Tiger B before, you'll be familiar with a lot of this kit, for obvious reasons. So the kit includes a jig to align all of the suspension arms in a straight line. That's not strictly necessary because the fit is so good anyway that they're generally in place. But it's a nice gesture. And once these road wheels were sanded down, I decided to glue them to each other so they could be removed in one big piece and painted separately to the hull. And of course, like all German tanks, there are lots of tools and tow cables and similar to be added. I'm not going to show you adding every single one of those because I'm sure you've done it before. If I did have one criticism of the Takom instructions, it's that they can be a little bit crowded at times, and in particular the arrows here get quite confusing. It's hard to work out what goes where, and you have arrows going under and over other arrows. I feel like this could be a little bit clearer. Perhaps with a square on side diagram, that might be a bit easier to read. The kit does include locked and open versions for the gun support, but it doesn't show any version with the gun barrel actually secured for travel. So I'm actually leaving the support off for now, and once I get towards the end of the build and I get the gun in place, then I will try to see if that's possible. I don't see why it shouldn't be. If the gun support is to scale, it should go over the barrel easily enough. The gun barrel itself is in 2 separate parts, so of course that needed some sanding, but not too much. The mechanism for fitting the gun barrel is quite simple, and it allows a small amount of movement up and down and left and right as well. It's quite interesting the way here that this part attaches directly to the lower hull. And then the upper hull slides into place from in front. Obviously the connections here need to be well glued because there's going to be a lot of torque on them when you move the gun barrel up or down. The rear plate is one of the items that has differences between the late version and the early version. So depending on which version you want to make, you'll either need to drill a couple of holes or remove a couple of features. I'm building a late version, and apparently one of the differences is that there's no jack and therefore no jacking block available on the late version. As you can see, all of the detail you'd expect from a Takom kit is here. It definitely hasn't lost anything for being what they call a Blitz kit. So I think this is a good example of a simplification in the building process of these Blitz kits. If you compare this rear deck here with the Tiger B which I made a while ago, the engine deck is just one piece here in this kit. It's still got all the detail on and there's still a little bit of PE and some other bits to be added, but in the full interior version, for obvious reasons, there must have been about 15 parts that went here to make this up. This kit does include photo etch parts, but as you can see it's significantly fewer parts than your average Takom kit, just the engine grills basically. And here's a good example of why you should read the instructions carefully. After building up the engine deck on the left hand side, I realised I'd selected the wrong base engine deck piece, and I should have selected the one on the right hand side for the late model. As it is, there's only really a couple of very small differences. The position of the mounting for the anti-aircraft machine gun is basically the only major difference. I'm not going to tear these pieces off here because it will just do more damage than good. And I'm sure that by the end of the war there were all kinds of mixes and matches of versions going on, so I'm not too fussed about that. One noticeable difference between this kit and regular kits is that there are no clear parts in this kit. All of the periscopes are supplied like this with regular styrene parts. And that's actually a change I quite like, because I don't like the idea of having to install clear parts normally and then mask them, or wait until the end after painting and weathering to install them, and then I forget to put them in. So I'm quite happy with that change, and of course you can always paint these whatever colour they should be. All of the hatches and doors on the kit are posable, open or closed, and in fact by leaving these hinges unglued I ended up with these doors movable, so I don't have to fix them in any one position, which is quite nice. One part that caused me loads of problems, and I was really surprised by this, was the front of the casemate here. As you can see here, it just does not fit. It's really bizarre. The section at the bottom here, if I don't drop it, is too big to go into the gap by a good millimetre. And you have to bear in mind that obviously this is the same on the other side as well, so if you get somehow this side forced in, the other side won't go in. It's just absolutely bizarre. And I can't have done anything in the wrong sequence because this whole upper hull is already one piece. In the end, this was the best that I could do, and basically what I did is I just carved off a millimetre with a knife at the bottom here, and I'll just fill that in later with some putty. But even with that, there's still a gap along the top, and if you push that it springs back out. You can tell there's way too much pressure on that piece there. And even down here at the bottom there's a gap there as well. I don't know what's going on with this piece. It's just of a completely different standard to every other piece in the kit. I'm not quite sure why that is, but yeah, definitely some brute force there, and definitely had me reaching for my favourite swear words. One of the more obvious differences between the early and late versions of the Jagdtiger is the gun mantlet. This is the late version. There are also some small differences here between the early on the left and the late on the right mudguards. Basically just this little tab here. The upper hull then slides nice and easily over the lower hull, and you can add the gun mantlet. I found I had to add an extra little bit of glue around the mantlet because the supplied tabs weren't really enough to hold it on. And then finally I could fit that travelling mechanism, that travelling lock mechanism around the gun. As I say, the instructions didn't give an option to put it in a travelling position, they only indicated it flat for the firing position. Now the tracks are Lincoln length, and there's this little jig supplied to shape them, but unless I'm completely stupid, I could not work out how to use it. The width of the jig is too wide to go in between the track teeth, so in the end I just put the tracks onto the kit itself and just shaped them around the wheels. And then once the tracks were dry, I removed them for separate painting and a little bit of weathering separately as well. And I painted those tracks in a mix of German grey and a little bit of brown. And although I probably should have done it after the weathering, I used a pencil to mark some polished steel marks where the wheels would make contact with the tracks. And with that, the kit was ready for priming and painting. For the paint schemes, I wasn't quite sure what to do. All of the paint schemes in the instructions are the standard German 3-colour camo, which I actually haven't done for a while, and I don't think I've done any since I started my YouTube channel. But I've always liked the German late war camo, which includes the red primer. A lot of people have done builds with the Jagdtiger or similar tanks in completely primer red, which apparently isn't realistic, but I still quite like the way it looks. But I'm also a fan of the sharp edge splinter camo schemes. So this is what I decided to do. And I thought I'd taken a picture of the overall tank at this stage, but I hadn't. But you'll see that in a moment. The decals are very, very thin on the ground, basically just the German crosses. And although you can put some numbers on, they are going to be obscured by the spare track links that are added anyway. Because I've painted over the tools and the cables, I wanted to give a little bit of indication of that paint rubbing off and revealing the metal beneath. So I used a combination of metallic grey for the chains and NATO black for the other tools, just to give that impression there that the paint is flaking off. And I did a similar thing at the front, using some light brown yellow for the wood of the spade handle and the other tools as well. I used a pin wash of dark brown oil paints, thinned with odourless thinner. I like this colour because it's a nice dark brown and it doesn't look like rust. And you can see there the difference between the pin wash and the non-pin wash versions. It just makes the detail stand out. I use the same wash in some of the details on the actual vehicle itself. So for example, the weld seams there. And of course on the other details like the bolt heads and so on around the tank. For some dirt effects, I used oil paint straight onto the vehicle, unthinned, and then I blended it into the surface with a dry paintbrush, no thinner on the brush. And I kept this effect mainly around things like the turret areas and certain recesses and so on. The great thing about oil paints, of course, is if you don't like it, you can always remove it later on with thinner, even a few hours, even a couple of days in fact, sometimes after the effect has been applied. And I think that adds a nice sort of grimy appearance to the top of the vehicle there. I did a similar thing on the wheels to add some dirt to those as well. And in some cases like this you need to add a little bit of thinner just to help the oil paint move around a little bit. For extra dirt effects I use 3 pigments: a really dark asphalt road dirt, a slightly lighter brown European earth, and then a much lighter light dust colour. I just brushed the very dark asphalt pigment straight onto the wheels. And then I fitted the wheels in place. I haven't shown the effects I made there on the side of the hull, partly because I don't like the way they look, and partly because they get completely covered up by the wheels and the tracks anyway, and the side skirts. For the tracks themselves I used a mix of thinner, the dark pigment and the European earth pigment. And then fixing the wheels and the tracks in place, it was time to put the side skirts on as well, and you can see how the side of the hull there is completely covered now. And at this stage I was quite happy with the vehicle, but it's still a little bit clean. So I decided to use some pigments to add a little bit more dirt, especially on the wheels. And to do that I just made some simple splatter effects by mixing the dark asphalt pigment with some thinner, gently flicking that onto the wheels. And I'm not looking for big sort of puddle splash effects all up the side of the vehicle here, like my truck I made recently. So I'm trying to keep this directly over the wheels. And then once that had dried I used the light dust pigment. And this time I applied it dry, I didn't use any thinner or anything to attach it. I didn't put this on as heavily as the previous pigment because I didn't want to cover it. And then finally a tiny amount of the brick dust pigment. This is quite a bright colour, so it needs to be used sparingly. And although I haven't shown it in the video, I put the light dust and brick pigments on the inside of the tracks as well. And then I used some track rust pigment for the spare track links, remembering to put it on the top and the side of these as well. And here is the final result. This was a really fun kit to build. The only thing that caused me problems in the end was the track links, trying to keep them together. And you can actually see in the video there's a couple of parts where they're not quite perfect. But overall, really fun kit. I'm very happy with the way the camouflage turned out. I couldn't decide whether or not to make the vehicle itself a little bit dirtier and dustier, but in the end I decided I would sort of quit while I was ahead. I didn't want to add too much to it. So thank you as always for watching, and if you did enjoy this video then please consider giving it a like, and I will see you in the next video.